Chapter 6 Doomsday Cults. I can say it often enough throughout this book, preparing for a disaster, including the eventual end of the world, is fine. Probably even smart. Living your life cowering in terror over it, or losing everything your soul truly knows about God and His love for you, is tragic. It's the difference between building a bomb shelter for the worst eventuality and then going on about your business, or building a bomb shelter and hiding in it for the rest of your life. That's not a life, not what God has in mind for any of us. And yet, in a way, the isolation and fear on which doomsday cults thrive are not unlike a life of cowering in a bomb shelter braced for a cataclysm that's probably a century away. I can honestly say I would rather face Armageddon any day than experience the nightmare of the stories in this chapter, each one of which can be directly traced to a clever narcissistic sociopath preying on society's innate fear of the end of the world and leading their victims to a fate far, far worse than doomsday will ever be. One of the most disquieting things about the populations of doomsday cults is that they come from every walk of life, every level of intelligence and financial status, every culture and race and every faith. We don't have the luxury of saying, "That could never happen to me or my perfectly sane family and friends." The truth is, yes, it could, unless we educate ourselves about these destructive cults, who joins them, and who creates them. Knowledge really is power. And there's another aspect of doomsday cults that's imperative to bear in mind. Compassion dictates that we never dismiss the victims of cults as simply a bunch of insane weirdos who deserved what happened to them. There's no such thing as a life that doesn't matter, especially when in most cases the only thing these victims did wrong was to run into a charismatic sociopath who happened to say all the right things when they were at their most vulnerable. Countless books have been written about cults, and there are many highly qualified experts on this subject. I would never claim to be one of them. But I've done my share of study, particularly about doomsday cults, and my share of working with victims of these cults and their equally victimized and devastated families and friends. So between a lot of reading and a lot of personal experiences throughout my 71 years, I've learned enough to make some informed observations. Doomsday cult members are often intensely devout believers in God, Jesus, the Bible, and the concept of Armageddon preceded by the arrival of a Christ-like Messiah. They tend to be inherently honest and well-intentioned, making it much more difficult for them to imagine that the charismatic, equally devout biblical expert who's trying to recruit them is actually a deceptive, manipulative sociopath who uses God, Jesus, and the scriptures as nothing but props and lures. They're typically searching for a place where they will feel they truly belong, where they get a sense of being an active, important part of something that matters. In some cases their lives have just gone through a major upheaval, maybe the loss of a job, a failed marriage, or the death of a significant other. In other cases, their lives have become mundane, unfulfilling, and, in their opinion, meaningless. Every bit as significantly, many of them have been taught to be blindly obedient to their religion whether it makes sense to them or not, while just as many who are more free-thinking have found some inconsistencies and/or leaps of logic in their church's philosophies. Almost unanimously, though, they believe themselves to be sinners, too flawed to deserve redemption, particularly when the end of the world comes and only the truly worthy will be saved. And then, if they're truly unlucky, along comes someone whose charisma, seeming self-assuredness, and outspoken passion for God draw them like moths to a flame. This man doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk, with plans to create a society separate from the cruel, self-centered, sinful, uncaring, pointless, godless world, a society where God is actively worshipped, in word and deed, every day, not just on Sundays. Everyone will be of equal importance in this new society, except, of course, its leader, hard at work for the common good, belonging, and absolving their past sins through their new pious devotion to God's will, translated through this charismatically devout man who has made their faith feel exhilarating again. That prophet they've been yearning for? He is that prophet, and he'll prove it. But he's not just a prophet. He's the Messiah their religion has been promising, the one they've been watching for, whose very appearance is a sign that the end is near and whose path is the one way to salvation when Armageddon comes. To doubt him or disobey him is to doubt or disobey God himself, never a good idea but a particularly bad idea on the threshold of doomsday. As for families and loved ones who aren't enlightened enough to understand or believe, the only defense against their hypocritical skepticism is complete separation. After all, if those heretics were as committed to the recruits' happiness and well-being as they claim, why were the recruits' lives so empty, meaningless, and devoid of the true light until now? In a life that has reached a point where it's filled with nothing but questions, in other words, what's more potentially appealing than a strong, God-centered voice saying, "I've got the answers you're looking for. Come with me." And the leaders, like most sociopaths, know how to attract exactly the followers they're after, the trusting rather than the skeptical, the generous rather than the selfish, the group-oriented rather than the loner, the hard-working rather than the lazy, and certainly those with an eagerness to believe in something far bigger and greater and more sacred than themselves rather than those who are satisfied with their lives and their beliefs. Once the aspiring cult leader has the attention of potential recruits, he'll usually fall into variations on a pattern of behavior that would be almost laughably predictable if it weren't so destructive. He'll claim that his personal theology is in unique possession of the truth, unlike traditional religions that are full of contradictions and hypocrisy. He'll also make claims that can't possibly be proven or disproven, that he's routinely receiving special orders and insights from God, that he's a reincarnated Messiah or prophet, that God has assigned this mission specifically to him, and most certainly that he and he alone can guide his most faithful followers safely into God's arms when the inevitable apocalypse comes, while the sinful non-believers on earth perish. As a test of devotion, he'll insist on either tithing from the group or the donation of his followers' earthly possessions and holdings. And what more efficient way to hold people in subtle captivity than to strip them of their resources? He'll typically have a list of admirable, irresistible group goals on hand that includes such humanitarian pursuits as feeding the poor, volunteering in missions and shelters, gathering clothing for the needy, etc. It's likely not to occur to the group until later that all their efforts are directed inward, not outward toward society in general. As quickly as possible he'll gather his recruits into some form of communal living situation, separate from their families and loved ones, explaining that only by committing their lives to God, and himself, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week can they prove their intention to be cleansed of the sins of society and embrace the pure, divine enlightenment that will see them through the end of the world. And what better way to control people's minds than to isolate them from everyone who can offer alternative points of view? Slowly but surely he'll begin dictating every detail of the lives of his followers once they're assembled and under his watchful eye. He'll typically start with a stupefying schedule of Bible studies, which are really his own selfing interpretations of carefully selected passages, none of them subject to questions or debate. The control will gradually extend and expand, under threat of God's/the leader's disapproval and/or banishment, so that eventually the group will be too intimidated to make even the simplest decisions on their own. An effective us against them mentality will be reinforced with monotonous regularity, so that any interference from such outsiders as families, friends, law enforcement, the IRS, the ATF, or any other governmental agency will be viewed as potentially fatal persecution from the godless heathens who are trying to destroy the Messiah's work on earth. And what more dire, terrifying threat for defecting from us to them than the Messiah's promise of eternal damnation when the end of times descends? The good news is, there are some telltale signs of a dangerous doomsday cult leader that make even the most skilled, charismatic liars among them relatively conspicuous if you listen closely, pay attention, and think. Any prophet/Messiah who claims to have a closer relationship with God than you do is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims you need him or her in order to communicate with God is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims that only he or she knows the truth of what God has in store for you, for your future, or for humankind is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims it is God's will that you cause harm to yourself or to any other living being is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims to be infallible is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims that all those who criticize him or disagree with him are evil and doomed to God's eternal wrath is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who demands isolation from those who have consistently loved, supported, and been honest with you, and who jeopardizes your financial security is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who insists that no one cares about or understands you as much as they do is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who believes he or she is exempt from the laws of God and society, and is entitled to divine immunity from consequences, is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah whose power is based on fear, abuse, and threats is a liar. Any prophet/Messiah who claims to be your sole source of salvation when the apocalypse happens is a liar. Heaven's Gate was a doomsday cult founded by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who adopted a variety of nicknames over the years, including the two, Bo, Do, rhymes with Bo, Peep, and Ti. Marshall and Bonnie declared themselves extraterrestrials who traveled here from the kingdom of heaven, a story they clearly preferred to the documented fact that they met in a psychiatric hospital where he was a patient and she was a nurse. Heaven's Gate actually evolved from a 1975 organization called the Human Individual Metamorphosis, whose members left their loved ones, careers, and earthly possessions behind to gather in a desert in Colorado awaiting a UFO that never came. The Human Individual Metamorphosis evolved into Total Overcomers Anonymous, formed by Do after Bonnie's death from cancer in 1985 and united in Do's apocalyptic belief that the Earth's population was about to be recycled. That group evolved into Heaven's Gate when Do relocated them to San Diego in the mid-1990s. Do taught his followers that our souls are separate, superior entities that temporarily take up residence in our bodies and that our soul's separation from our bodies is the final act of metamorphosis. His soul, by the way, had once resided in the human body we know as Jesus Christ after traveling here in a spaceship 2,000 years ago. The extraterrestrial beings who travel throughout the universe in those spaceships are on a mission to elevate humanity's level of knowledge, which is why Do referred to extraterrestrials as the level above human. The purpose of Heaven's Gate's members was to prepare themselves to enter the kingdom of heaven, believing as they did that they were separate from and superior to the evil forces that control Earth. Once their preparation was complete, they believed, they'd be transported to the kingdom by committing suicide as a group, liberating their souls from their earthly bodies. Their souls, after a brief period of sleep, would ultimately be absorbed by a level above human who was waiting for them on board a spaceship that, according to Du, was hidden behind Comet Hale-Bopp that was passing close to Earth in 1997. Du was clearly warning the rest of us that the end of life on our planet was imminent in a videotaped message in which he said, "You can follow us, but you cannot stay here and follow us. You would have to follow quickly by also leaving this world before the conclusion of our leaving this atmosphere in preparation for its recycling." On March 22, 1997, shortly after that videotape was made, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including Du, lay down on mattresses in their immaculate San Diego house and killed themselves with a mixture of phenobarbital and vodka. The 18 men and 21 women ranged in age from 26 to 72. They were dressed in identical black mandarin collared shirts, black pants, and Nike shoes. The suicides took place in 3 shifts over a period of 3 days, 15 on the first day, 15 on the second day, and 9 on the third, so that those left behind could cover the bodies with purple shrouds bearing the words Heaven's Gate. All of the deceased were also found with their identification in their pockets, as well as a $5 bill and 3 quarters. An astute columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle subsequently unearthed a quote from Mark Twain that seems as if it must be more than just an unfortunate coincidence. The fare to get to heaven on the tail of a comet was $5.75. A suicide note from the group read, "By the time you read this, we suspect that the human bodies we were wearing have been found. We came from the level above human in distant space, and we have now exited the bodies that we were wearing for our earthly task, to return to the world from whence we came. Task completed." Task completed, tragically and needlessly, to escape the imminent recycling of life on Earth that proved to be nothing more than the manipulative rhetoric of a man who clearly thought the purpose of having power was to abuse it. Jim Jones and the People's Temple. 2 decades before the Heaven's Gate tragedy was the horror of the People's Temple, a doomsday cult founded by a well-educated former mainstream Christian named James Warren Jones. Initially ordained in the Disciples of Christ Church, Jim Jones originally founded the People's Temple in 1955 as a mission in Indianapolis devoted to helping those who were living in poverty and with catastrophic illness. He began his ministry preaching the Holy Bible, love, and equality to his large interracial congregation. He also began claiming the ability to cure cancer and heart disease, which understandably prompted the first of many unwelcome governmental investigations into Jim Jones, his organizations, and his practices. The more powerful Jim Jones became in the eyes of his followers, the more he rejected the Bible as a pack of lies and taught that he himself was the Messiah, the second coming of Christ. Only he claimed, stood between his congregation and the imminent destruction of the world in a nuclear holocaust. He and his devoted, multiracial People's Temple membership, being on the side of enlightened righteousness in an otherwise evil society, would be the sole survivors of this nuclear extermination, thanks to an anticipatory mass suicide and simultaneous resurrection, and they would create a new Eden. It was probably no coincidence that in 1965, right around the time the government started its first investigation of Jim Jones, he moved the People's Temple to Northern California, more specifically, to Ukiah, which Esquire magazine listed as one of 9 U.S. cities that could survive a nuclear attack. As the People's Temple expanded into San Francisco and Los Angeles, the Gospel according to Jim Jones became more and more communistic and anti-Christian, and his dangerously manic behavior increased in direct proportion to his addiction to prescription drugs, primarily phenobarbital. At the same time, defectors from the church began reporting Jim Jones's and the People's Temple's human rights practices and potential income tax abuses to the government and the news media. By 1977, the pressure from such close scrutiny inspired Jones to lead about 1,000 of his most devoted People's Temple members to relocate to a 4,000-acre agricultural project on land they'd leased from the government of Guyana in 1974. Jonestown, as the project came to be called, was anticipated as a communal promised land. Instead, it involved brutally difficult work and a sparse, regimented existence in the middle of the steamy South American jungle, thousands of miles from everyone and everything familiar. Jim Jones's health and sanity suffered dramatically from the relocation, so that sudden rages and hours of delusional ranting over the Jonestown loudspeakers long into the night weren't uncommon. Finally, a man named Tim Stone, a member of the upper echelon of the People's Temple organization and Jim Jones's closest advisor, defected from the group, returned to the United States and formed a group of his own. It was called the Concerned Relatives, and its purpose was to liberate loved ones from the concentration camp of Jonestown and the grip of Jim Jones and the People's Temple. The Concerned Relatives' efforts were so effective that in November of 1978, members of the media joined California Congressman Leo Ryan on a fact-finding trip to Guyana. The residents of Jonestown put on a great display of communal harmony to welcome Congressman Ryan and his companions on their arrival, and Jim Jones assured the visitors that, contrary to the Concerned Relatives' reports, all members of the People's Temple were free to leave the organization and Guyana any time they liked. That claim lost all credibility the next day when one of the reporters received a note from a Jonestown resident asking for help in escaping. A total of 16 People's Temple escapees left for the airstrip with the Ryan party that morning. As they emerged from the truck to board the 2 planes that were waiting there for them, they were ambushed by a handful of Jim Jones's gunmen. Congressman Ryan, an escaped resident of Jonestown, and 3 members of the media were killed. The rest of the group suffered severe injuries. That horror was only the beginning of the unspeakable Jonestown tragedy on November 18, 1978. Jim Jones was well aware that international law enforcement would demand justice for the murders and attempted murders he'd ordered at the airstrip. He also knew that the People's Temple could never survive the inevitable impending media scrutiny. And so he gathered the residents of Jonestown in the community center and announced that the time had come for the mass exodus from this evil world they'd prepared for as part of their commitment to him, their Messiah, their second coming of Christ. In other words, he ordered the revolutionary suicide of every member of the People's Temple, from the elderly to the helpless children and infants. Most drank Kool-Aid spiked with cyanide and various tranquilizers. Jim Jones took a far easier way out, with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. In the end, solely on his orders, more than 900 residents of Jonestown and 5 people at the nearby Guyana airstrip lost their lives that day. It's hard to imagine that the nuclear holocaust he warned against with such fervor would have been worse than the cruel deaths the membership of the People's Temple suffered at the hands of the man to whom they literally entrusted their lives. The Branch Davidians in the early 19th century, a man named William Miller founded a group called the Millwrights. Among other things, the Millwrights predicted that the end of the world, heralded by the second coming of Jesus Christ, would occur on October 22, 1844. When that date came and went fairly uneventfully, October 22, 1844, came to be known to the millwrights, understandably, as the Great Disappointment. The millwrights picked several more end-of-the-world dates, all based on their interpretation of certain biblical passages. When those dates proved to be as meaningless as had October 22, 1844, the membership of the millwrights declined significantly. Several members, though, persisted in their basic belief in an imminent, ultimate battle between good and evil and in the second coming of Christ. In 1863 they formed the Seventh-day Adventists, most definitely a church as opposed to a cult, and still thriving, with a current membership of more than 12 million worldwide. In 1919, a man named Victor Houteff joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But 10 years later, after finding what he perceived to be several flaws in the church and its doctrines, he left to form his own sect, the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, which ultimately evolved into the Branch Davidians. It was in 1935 that Houteff bought land for his Davidian Adventists outside of Waco, Texas, and named the settlement the Mount Carmel Center. One day in 1981, a 22-year-old dyslexic high school dropout and failed rock star named Vernon Howell joined the Branch Davidians in Waco. By 1990, he'd staged a heavily armed takeover of the Mount Carmel Center, become leader of the Branch Davidians, and changed his name to David Koresh. As he explained to his congregates, David came from his being the reigning ruler of the biblical house of David, and Koresh was the Hebrew form of the name Cyrus, the king of Persia who freed the Jewish prisoners in Babylon so they could return to Israel. David Koresh taught that he was the Messiah, the second coming the Branch Davidians had been anticipating since their inception, God's messenger who would personally trigger the apocalypse and then guide his followers safely to salvation. In his tediously repetitive marathon Bible studies, he instilled belief that he would be leading his flock into violent battle with the U.S. government that would mark the end of the world and his followers' passage to eternal lives. No one within the Branch Davidians was allowed contact with anyone on the outside, since those outsiders were evil and bound to lead them away from the righteousness embodied by no one but David Koresh. He had 20 wives within the cult, who he promised would have the honor of bearing his soldiers. Conveniently, he ordered that all the Branch Davidian men take a vow of celibacy. His youngest wife was the 10-year-old daughter of a devout Koresh follower. And in case any of Koresh's younger wives or other children in the Mount Carmel Center chose to disobey or misbehave, a wooden paddle was always nearby for beatings as severe as the Messiah demanded. David Koresh accepted and achieved nothing less than total devotion and absolute, unquestioning obedience from his flock. That fact became tragically apparent during a 51-day standoff, the horrifying realization of David Koresh's vision of a violent battle with the U.S. government that would mark the end of his followers' world. The government had indeed been watching Koresh, the Branch Davidians, and the suspicious activities at the Mount Carmel Center, and on February 28, 1993, literally dozens of agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms arrived with a warrant to search the compound for illegal weapons. After an initial gun battle in which 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians were killed, David Koresh allowed a handful of ATF agents into the compound just long enough to remove their dead comrades. And then the standoff began. ATF heavy artillery aimed squarely at the compound and probably just as much heavy artillery aimed right back at the ATF. The best of the best FBI negotiators were brought in to keep up a dialogue with David Koresh on the direct phone line the ATF had arranged. The negotiators' top priority was to secure the freedom of the 46 children who'd been living as innocent hostages behind the distant center walls. It was finally agreed that David Koresh would broadcast a series of 2-minute sermons on the radio and that he would release 2 children for each sermon. That agreement led to the release of 21 children in the first 5 days. After a standoff that lasted a total of 51 days, the government agencies that had assembled near Waco at the Branch Davidian compound arrived at the horribly flawed conclusion that in the end, if they forcefully attacked, the majority of adults holed up within the center would make their escape to save the children still left inside. Completely miscalculating the control David Koresh had over his followers, and their belief that death would lead them and their children to the eternal glory their Messiah had promised, the agents advanced on the compound with a full battalion of tanks and tear gas. Within minutes, the Mount Carmel Center was engulfed in flames. Approximately 50 adults and 25 children died in the fire. Among the casualties was David Koresh. And perhaps as a testament to David Koresh's final, maniacal insistence on total control over his own and his followers' destiny, the catastrophic fire that consumed the compound, according to FBI wiretaps, appeared to have been set. So in a way, he was absolutely prophetic. He predicted the end of the world and then played his part in seeing to it for all those people who trusted him, and all those innocent children who had no choice about it at all. Somehow I think the Branch Davidians expected more and better from their long-awaited Messiah. The Unification Church, Sun Myung Moon legend has it that one day in 1936, on a Korean mountainside, Jesus Christ appeared to a 16-year-old boy and gave him the news that he'd been chosen by God to establish the kingdom of heaven on earth. That boy, Sun Myung Moon, proclaimed himself the Messiah, the Second Coming, or the Lord of the Second Advent, and, in 1954, established what was officially called the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, commonly known as the Unification Church. Half a century later, its membership purportedly numbers in the tens of thousands in 100 countries around the world. By 1957 the Reverend Moon, a self-ordained title, had written a 536-page manifesto called Divine Principle, which he claimed was directly communicated to him by Jesus Christ. Moonas, as his followers are called, believe the divine principle to be the Third Testament of the Bible and follow its authority with unflinching loyalty. And predictably, anyone who questions Moon's status as the Messiah or doubts the credibility of the divine principle is in league with the devil, doing Satan's handiwork. Among the basics of Moon's teachings, Adam and Eve were initially created to have a platonic relationship until they reached perfection. Only then would they be worthy of marriage and childbearing for the purpose of establishing God's kingdom on earth. But because of Eve's sexual sin, sex with the devil, i.e., the spiritual fall from grace followed by sex with Adam, i.e., the physical fall from grace, God's intention for them to be the true parents of humankind was never realized. Because of Eve's sexual relationship with Satan, all sin committed by unredeemed humans is not a moral choice but is instead the result of genetics. We're all sinners as descendants of Eve and Satan, in other words, until and unless we achieve salvation. And what do you know? Sun Myung Moon is the only possible source of salvation. Salvation via Moon could happen for women by being cleansed by him, which meant having sexual intercourse with him. It could happen for men through blood cleansing, or having sexual intercourse with a woman who'd been cleansed by moon. It could happen through a marriage personally orchestrated and blessed by moon. Or it could happen by absolute submission to Sun Myung Moon's omnipotence, willingness to allow moon to select a mate, to hand over all earthly assets to the church, to encourage their children to think of moon and his wife as their true parents, and so on. Jesus Christ, according to divine principle Sun Myung Moon, was not the Son of God or the result of a virgin birth. Jesus's intended purpose was to father perfect children through an approved marriage, but he was crucified before he could accomplish that purpose. Rather than symbolizing redemption for Christians, the cross is actually a symbol of failure, and Jesus never experienced a physical resurrection. The second coming that God promised isn't a reference to Jesus at all. It's a reference to a third Adam who will satisfy God's long-awaited plan of providing physical salvation through marriage, from which genetically sin-free children would be born. Moon's divine principle unmistakably implies that Moon himself is that third Adam. The true Trinity is composed of God, the third Adam, and his bride, and God's kingdom on earth can be realized only through the marriages Moon and his wife personally arrange or approve. Members of the Unification Church are the only true family, with the glorified title of true parents being reserved for no one but Moon, aka the third Adam, and his exalted wife. The fact that Moon divorced his first 3 wives doesn't seem to diminish the Moon's enthusiasm for the true parents concept, which certainly implies that 1/3 of the Church's Trinity is interchangeable. Salvation is complete only when both physical and spiritual redemption have taken place. Physical redemption requires total obedience to Sun Myung Moon, the third Adam, while spiritual redemption requires fundraising, enlisting new church members, and other means of expanding Moon's power. But God will not forgive until and unless there has been some payment for the sins that have been committed by us flawed humans. Moon has 12 children, by the way, and since they were fathered by the third Adam and have therefore been genetically purified, they're considered by Moonists to be without sin. The commonly prophesied end of the world actually refers to the end of evil on earth, which coincidentally can be achieved only through the auspices of Sun Myung Moon. Moon summed up his beliefs about himself, to which he requires Moonists to adhere unequivocally, in the following way: there have been saints, prophets, many religious leaders in past human history. Master here referring to himself is more than any of those people and greater than Jesus himself. I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Which makes his recurring legal problems seem more than a little ironic. He's been convicted and spent time in prison over the years for such varied crimes as perjury, fraud, bigotry, and tax evasion. And yet his holdings include major shares in about 300 U.S. corporations and foundations, from publishing companies to newspapers to toy, clothing, and jewelry manufacturers. The Reverend Sun Myung Moon promised that the Messiah would be revealed, not in the clouds as the Bible predicts but here on earth, by the year 2000. That Messiah was not to be Jesus Christ, who failed in his mission a couple of millennia ago. Instead, it was to have been a man born in 1920 in Korea as Moon was, and God was to punish all who failed to recognize and embrace that Messiah. All these years later, the validity of Sun Myung Moon as the world's savior is still eluding me and many of you as well, I'm sure. And so far that seems to be okay with God. Have you noticed? Jeffrey Lundgren, I almost hate to give this man the dignity of having his name mentioned in print. But since he's been executed and is no longer around to bask in a little more publicity, I do think he's useful as a comparatively tiny example of how a doomsday prophet can destroy the lives of perfectly intelligent, well-meaning people. Jeffrey Lundgren was born in Independence, Missouri, in 1950 to parents who were active in a Mormon splinter group called the Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints. His father was a strict disciplinarian with a passion for firearms, a passion he eagerly shared with his son. His mother, by all accounts, was a rigid, fairly distant woman. Jeffrey was a rather chubby, unattractive, inexplicably arrogant boy without a shred of talent for sports or other activities that traditionally inspire admiration among schoolmates. What he did have an uncanny talent for was memorizing and reciting endless biblical passages, and he learned very early in life that the appearance of an unusual closeness to God, even if it was utterly insincere and acquired only by rote, was an easy way to establish his popularity and self-proclaimed superiority. He was attending Central Missouri State University when he met and began dating a fellow RLDS student named Alice Keeler. Alice was a shy loner who'd grown up with a father who was often depressed and violent toward her and her siblings when using his vast array of multiple sclerosis medications, and a mother who worked long hard hours to support the family. An RLDS leader had once told her that she would meet and marry a prophet of true greatness, so when she began dating and became pregnant by Jeffrey Lundgren, she assumed he must be that prophet of true greatness and became his slavishly obedient wife. After 4 years in the Navy, Lundgren was unsuccessful at any number of jobs because of his arrogance and irresponsibility. He was also an abusive husband and serial philanderer, while Alice stood by her man, bore his 4 children, and continued clinging to her marriage, assuming there could be nothing but hell to pay for walking out on an RLDS prophet of true greatness. In the meantime, Jeffrey was becoming disenchanted with the RLDS and decided to form his own sect, essentially a splinter group of this Mormon splinter group. He proclaimed himself the one whose divine mission it was to unearth the truth in the Holy Bible, and his childhood talent of reciting endless biblical passages worked just as effectively to attract followers when he was an arrogant, abusive, philandering, flat-broke father of 4. Those followers were classic examples of perfectly decent, earnest, devout people who simply bought into the very skilled act of a very skilled fraud. One of them in later years said that when Jeffrey Lundgren came along, he felt for the first time as if he'd found a family where he belonged and where he was wanted. Another made this simple, tragic statement: "I felt like everything I'd ever done, I'd failed at it. Jeffrey made me feel as if finally I could do something right, and something important, by following him and doing God's work." His growing flock began donating money to support Jeffrey and his family, but he quickly grew dissatisfied with the modest donations and announced that according to orders from the Bible itself, it was time for him and his family to move to Kirtland, Ohio, where God would be endowing him with his true messianic power. Kirtland, Ohio, wasn't a random destination for Jeffrey Lundgren. Based on a revelation from God, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, had a huge, magnificent temple built there in 1836, and Jeffrey and Alice Lundgren quickly secured jobs as tour guides at the temple when they moved to Kirtland in 1984. It didn't take long for Jeffrey to become dissatisfied with his meager tour guide salary, and he began dipping into the temple's donations and profits to the tune of what's estimated to be from $25,000 to $30,000. Jeffrey's job as an RLDS guide gave him access to visitors from around the country, and during tours he would teach and preach his own unorthodox, messianic, self-absorbed version of the scriptures. His proclamations of himself as a prophet and the reincarnated Christ, along with an arrogance that the vulnerable and naive translated as spiritual superiority, began inspiring followers to move to Kirtland to learn at the feet of this charismatic man who promised them salvation from the impending Armageddon. Before long, the RLDS officials became aware of Jeffrey's shocking variations on the teachings of the Church and confronted him. In response, Jeffrey withdrew his church membership and quit his job. Undoubtedly with the help of stolen church funds, not to mention the increasing number of followers who began handing over their paychecks and other worldly possessions to their new great prophet and Messiah, Jeffrey moved his family and his faithful flock to a rented farm in the countryside near Kirtland. It was at the farm that Jeffrey started wearing military fatigues on a regular basis, including during interminable Bible studies. He accumulated a large arsenal, carried a loaded gun at all times, and interspersed prayer sessions with marksmanship and combat training. He became the sole arbiter of what constituted a sin, which could include anything from withholding a paycheck from him to sitting in the wrong chair at communal dinners. He became the group's sole recipient of God's commands, and its sole salvation in the impending war of Armageddon. The final days of this planet were imminent, he warned relentlessly. Without him there was no hope of meeting God and being endowed with eternal life. Among Jeffrey's future plans for his spiritual, godly group was the seizing of the RLDS temple that had banished him. To earn their place on his promised journey to see God himself, his followers were required not only to overtake the temple but also to promise to kill anyone and everyone who got in their way. The arsenal grew, the combat training intensified, and the endless Bible recitations droned on. It was February of 1988 when one of the devotees, Kevin Curry, finally caught on that Jeffrey Lundgren wasn't a messiah or a prophet, he was simply a dangerous, cruel, sociopathic, megalomaniacal thug who used his knowledge of the Bible and his followers' terror of doomsday, and of him, to achieve complete domination. Curry escaped the farm and fled to Buffalo, New York, fearing Jeffrey's retribution every step of the way. He contacted the FBI about Jeffrey, his arsenal, the relentless combat training among his blindly obedient followers, and his plan to seize the RLDS temple. Not completely convinced the report wasn't a prank, the FBI faxed the information to Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough. Chief Yarborough took the report seriously and initiated an investigation into Jeffrey Lundgren and his family and followers at the relatively isolated farm. Unbeknownst to Kevin Curry, the FBI, or the Kirtland Police, Jeffrey, thanks to yet another vision, had significantly revised the means by which his flock could earn their place on the journey to see God, and prove their dedication and total obedience to their Messiah, Jeffrey Lundgren. Rather than overtaking the RLDS temple, they should focus on a goal much closer to home. They should sacrifice, execute, a family that had been getting on Jeffrey's nerves ever since they had arrived at the farm. Dennis Avery wasn't living up to Jeffrey's idea of a true man and head of the household, often deferring to his wife and letting her make some of the few decisions Jeffrey left to them. Dennis also questioned Jeffrey occasionally during Bible classes, which was an act of heresy. Cheryl Avery, Dennis's wife, was headstrong and clearly didn't understand or respect the appropriately subservient, dutiful role of a woman in the household and the group in general. And the Averys' 3 daughters, aged 15, 13, and 6, were just plain unruly and disobedient. Add them all up and it was obvious God would never grant the group forgiveness if they knowingly allowed sin to exist among them, and without God's forgiveness, there would be no eternity for them. But if the group sent the most egregious sinners in the compound, the Averies, to arrive at the judgment bar before the rest of them arrived, God would take out his wrath on the Avery family and spare the followers of their great prophet and Messiah, Geoffrey Lundgren. And so it was that on April 17, 1989, while Alice Lundgren disappeared for a few hours with the youngest children of the group, the Avery family was led one by one to the barn near the main house under a variety of pretexts and executed by the men and women of this devout group and their divine savior, Geoffrey Lundgren. Dennis Avery was the first to be killed. 6-year-old Karen Avery was the last. Their bodies were placed in a pre-dug pit and covered with lime and dirt, with nothing but a few trash bags to mark their mass grave. It had to be done, Geoffrey reflected afterward. It was commanded by God. It can only be described as tragic irony that the morning after the murders, the Kirtland police and the FBI arrived at the farm. They knew nothing about the execution of the Avery family that had taken place the night before, so they had no reason to ask about it. Instead, they were there to follow up on rumors that weapons were being amassed and that a takeover of the Mormon temple was being plotted. They found nothing of any specific relevance to those rumors. They could give the farm only a cursory glance since they had no probable cause for a search warrant and none of Lundgren's followers volunteered information that could have led law enforcement to the 5 bodies that had been buried in the barn the night before. Alice Lundgren used the excuse much later that law enforcement weren't asking the right questions. But neither she nor anyone else in the group had helped by coaching the police and the FBI on what those right questions were. Another Lundgren follower, a meek-looking woman in her 40s, explained her silence, and her participation in the Avery murders, with the chillingly simple statement, "I was a sinner, and I knew I could be next." That same day, the day after the murders and the day the law showed up unexpectedly at the farm, Geoffrey Lundgren divided his followers into small groups and ordered them to leave the farm at intervals during the night. They were to travel to a specific location in Pennsylvania, where he and his family would meet them and give them further instructions. A Kirtland police officer drove past the farm a few days later and found it chilling that the Lundgren camp seemed to have abandoned the property awfully suddenly. The Lundgren group settled temporarily in Tucker County, West Virginia, where Geoffrey claimed that God would lead him to the sword of Laban, referred to in the Book of Mormon as a symbol of divine authority and kingship. From there it was off to a barn near Chilhowie, Missouri, without the sword of Laban, which had somehow eluded Geoffrey's grasp, where after a cold winter week Geoffrey disbanded the group, ordering the men to get jobs so that they'd have money to give to Geoffrey when they reconvened in the spring. Throughout his time in West Virginia and the move back to Missouri, Geoffrey had become even more violent, paranoid, and megalomaniacal than ever. Foxholes, 24-hour-a-day guards, and even an anti-aircraft machine gun to shoot down law enforcement helicopters were among the new staples of the group. The married men were ordered to willingly offer their wives to Geoffrey on his whim so that they could be cleansed with his seed. Geoffrey knew and thrived on the fact that his followers were now too terrified of him to disobey him, and he reminded them on a regular basis that the same thing could happen to any one of them that had happened to the Averies if he chose. And if constant fear of his wrath wasn't frightening enough, he also reminded them over and over and over again that the end of the planet Earth was right around the corner, and only he held the key to their survival and to God's willingness to welcome them into his kingdom. There was yet another fear holding the group's devotion to Geoffrey Lundgren together, a psychological angle that's not uncommon among cult members. Those who were beginning to have doubts about their Messiah's sanctity as a prophet and son of God had to face the fact that if Jeffrey Lundgren was a fraud and a liar, then they had participated in killing 5 innocent people, 3 of them children, for reasons having nothing whatsoever to do with God or His will. Their basic ability to live with themselves and what they'd done was dependent on believing in Lundgren's authenticity. When the group temporarily disbanded, Jeffrey took Alice, their son Damon and the younger children, and loyal devotee Danny Kraft to the warmth of San Diego, California, where he and Alice had lived for a short time after Jeffrey's tour of duty in the Navy. A few of the group, in the meantime, seized the opportunity to escape Jeffrey Lundgren once and for all, finally abandoning their hope that he wasn't simply a cruel, murdering madman. Among them was a man named Keith Johnson, whose conscience about the Avery murders was eating him alive. And so on December 31, 1989, Keith poured his heart out to Kansas City law enforcement about the murders and everything else he knew about Jeffrey Lundgren. He even drew them a map to the exact location of the Avery family's grave. That map and a written report of Keith's story triggered a series of events that led to Chief Yarborough and several of his deputies in the Kirtland, Missouri, police department to arrive at and search the still abandoned farm on January 3, 1990. Following Keith Johnson's map, they found the grave site of the Avery family fairly quickly, and the tragic news of the murdered family buried in a barn quickly captured the attention of the local and national media. Warrants were issued for Jeffrey and Alice Lundgren, their 19-year-old son Damon, and 10 of Jeffrey's followers, some of whom turned themselves in the moment they saw the televised reports that the Averys had been found. On January 7, 1990, Jeffrey Lundgren, his wife, Alice, and their son, Damon, were arrested in their motel room in California. Law enforcement also seized the arsenal of weapons and ammunition the Messiah and Great Prophet had assembled. The Lundgren family, after some predictable legal wrangling, were extradited back to Missouri, where they were reunited with their old devotees in jail, awaiting a series of trials. Alice and Damon Lundgren were each sentenced to 5 life terms. 9 of Jeffrey's followers were given a lesser variety of sentences. Larry Johnson, the informant/hero who'd bravely stepped forward to law enforcement, was given immunity for his testimony. Despite a stupefying 4-hour plea for mercy to the jury that included the claim, "It's not a figment of my imagination that I can in fact talk to God, that I can hear His voice. I am a prophet of God. I am even more than a prophet," Jeffrey Lundgren was sentenced to death. As the date of his execution approached, he tried to convince the courts that he was too obese and diabetic to be executed without a cruel and unusual amount of pain. The courts didn't agree, and on Tuesday, October 24, 2006, Jeffrey Lundgren, Messiah and Great Prophet or murderer, liar, philanderer, thief, abuser, narcissist, sociopath, depending on whom you talk to, was executed his own personal doomsday, I guess, but undoubtedly not what his devoted followers had in mind when he assured them that the end of the world was right around the corner. The Manson family. It is common, tragic knowledge that Charles Manson and his family of devout followers committed some of the most infamous murders in the history of American crime. At Manson's command, and under his absolute control, 5 young people viciously slaughtered 7 total strangers in 2 separate upscale neighborhoods in the Los Angeles area in 1969. The exhaustive publicity of the Manson family, its brutality, its journey through the court system, and, above all, its diminutive, wild-eyed leader, Charles Manson, has left the indelible memory in most people's minds of the insanity of a band of drug-crazed hippies. And there's no doubt about it, these killers were drug-crazed, by their own admissions, and they looked and lived like many hippies of the late 1960s, in a communal, unstructured environment. What often gets lost in the historic infamy of the Manson family is the fact that, at its core, it was a doomsday cult, with Charles Manson as its messiah. And it's as clear an example as we'll ever find of the fact that the Bible can be twisted, turned, and stood on its head depending on the mind and motivations of whoever's reading it. In other words, we really don't have the luxury of believing that if we're not drug-crazed hippies, we're immune to persuasive doomsday saviors with off-center, selfing interpretations of the Book of Revelation. Whether Charles Manson actually believed his complicated view of the apocalypse or whether he simply used it when he discovered it was an effective manipulation device is anybody's guess. But then, let's face it, the same issue could easily be raised about Marshall Applewhite, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Sun Myung Moon, Jeffrey Lundgren, and every other doomsday cult leader who systematically destroyed the lives of a lot of trusting, vulnerable, unfulfilled, God-fearing people. Charles Manson was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, on November 12, 1934. His mother was 16 years old. The identity of his father was never clearly established, and whoever he was, Manson claims never to have met him. Manson's last name came from his mother's brief marriage to an older man named William Manson. Manson had what can best be described as an unstable childhood. For the most part he was raised by his grandmother and/or his aunt while his mother was either in prison for armed robbery or simply not around for days and weeks at a time. He was 12 years old when he began bouncing back and forth between boys' homes and jail. He committed his first armed robbery when he was 13 and was in and out of prisons and reformatories until he was 19. He was evaluated by any number of prison counselors and too few psychiatrists, all of whom found him disturbed and disturbing. At the same time, one of them commented that Manson possessed certain facile techniques for dealing with people. These consist of a good sense of humor and an ability to ingratiate himself. In fact, he enthusiastically took a Dale Carnegie course on how to win friends and influence people during his teenage years, and even though he didn't finish, he apparently picked up some effective pointers. He also seems to have picked up some effective pointers for attracting the family in the future when he began his first real career in Los Angeles, as a pimp. He traveled to Los Angeles in 1955 in a car he stole in Ohio. Then came more prison time, for a variety of federal offenses, during which he dabbled in Scientology, the Bible, and Buddhism long enough to adopt some jargon from all three, and he became obsessed with songwriter, playing the guitar, and, most significantly, the Beatles. It was after those stints in prison that Charles Manson began accumulating followers, the vast majority of whom were in their late teens to early 20s and, for a variety of reasons, in search of a sense of belonging and being part of something that mattered. Or, as one of the family members put it, traveling around the country looking for God. He started in the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco, one of the most famous gathering places for the hippie movement of the late 1960s, and returned to Los Angeles with the first female members of the family. Between his guitar playing, songwriter, female entourage, and developing philosophy about the approaching Armageddon, Manson temporarily attracted the curiosity of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson and record producer Terry Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day, who was living with actress Candice Bergen at 10050 Cielo Drive, a small street near Benedict Canyon, which cuts through the Hollywood Hills. One night, Charles Manson happened to be a passenger when Dennis Wilson drove Terry Melcher home to Cielo Drive and dropped him off at the gate. The Cielo Drive house was subsequently leased to director Roman Polanski and his beautiful actress wife, Sharon Tate. There are strong theories that it was Terry Melcher's ultimate rejection of Charles Manson and his music that inspired Manson to choose 10050 Cielo Drive as the target for 6 savage murders committed at his command on August 9, 1969 of Stephen Parent, age 18, Sharon Tate, 26, actress, Sharon's unborn son, Abigail Folger, 25, Folger's coffee heiress, Wojtek Frykowski, 32, boyfriend of Abigail Folger, and Jay Sebring, 35, renowned hairstylist. Less than 24 hours later, several miles away in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles, 2 more murders took place on Manson's orders. Leno LaBianca, 44, owner of a successful chain of supermarkets, and his wife, Rosemary, 38, owner of a dress shop, were viciously killed in their own home. All the dead were Caucasian. The word pig had been written in blood at both locations, and at the LaBianca house the word helter skelter sick was scrawled in blood on the refrigerator door. And contrary to the initial impressions of the Los Angeles police, the murders were far from motiveless, and the words pig and, properly spelled, helter-skelter were partial keys to unraveling the twisted tragic mystery of yet another doomsday cult. At its simplest, Manson's prophecy of enroll in the apocalypse went like this, and it was undoubtedly even more convincing when told with mind-numbing repetition to a bunch of lost, vulnerable young people with an endless supply of recreational drugs in their systems. While Charles Manson apparently never made any specific claim of being the reincarnated Christ, he spoke often of having once lived 2,000 years ago, a lifetime that ended with his death on the cross. He also regaled the family on countless occasions with his vision during a psychedelic mushroom trip. The bed he was lying on became a cross. He could feel the nails in his feet and see Mary Magdalene weeping below him, and when he surrendered to death he could see through the eyes of all humanity at the same time. Many family members later admitted that they truly believed Charles Manson was Jesus, returned to earth as a sign promised in the Bible that the end of the world was coming. The biblical book of Revelation, 9:15, reads, "So the 4 angels were released, who had been ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, to kill a third of mankind." The 4 angels, Manson was sure, were the Beatles. This belief was reinforced by an earlier reference, Revelation 9:3, to locusts, obviously synonymous with beetles in Manson's interpretation, especially as they're described in verses 7 and 8. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, they had scales like iron breastplates. The Beatles' guitars, they have tails like scorpions, the guitars' electrical cords. The first verse of Revelation 9 refers to a 5th angel, and he was given the key of the shaft of the bottomless pit, who's later referred to in verse 11, they the locusts have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. Needless to say, that 5th angel of the bottomless pit, that 5th beetle, was Charles Manson. As a result, Manson convinced himself and the family that the Beatles were sending him messages through their songs. To name just a couple, George Harrison's Piggies, recorded on the Beatles' White Album, was a commentary on materialism, society's upper class, and greed. Obviously, To Manson, it was an edict to select materialistic, upper-class victims to murder, and to leave the word pig in the victim's blood as a kind of souvenir/explanation. And then there was the song Helter Skelter, also on the White Album, which contains the lyrics, "When I get to the bottom I go back to the top of the slide / where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride / till I get to the bottom and I see you again." To the Beatles it was undoubtedly a harmless reference to the amusement park slide that in England is called Helter Skelter. To Manson it was a description of the family emerging from the bottomless pit to reclaim the world after the Great War of Armageddon. Another Beatles song from the White Album begins, "Blackbird singing in the dead of night / take these broken wings and learn to fly / all your life you were only waiting for this moment to arise." Manson's interpretation, in the War of Armageddon the blacks were going to rise up against the whites and destroy them. See the above reference to Revelation 9:15 about killing a third of mankind. A third of mankind, Manson said, was the Caucasian race. The Beatles were telling the blacks that the time had come for the war to begin. Unfortunately, the blacks weren't moving quickly enough for Manson's taste, so he commanded the family to begin the slaughter of Caucasians and pigs, as brutally and violently as possible. The blacks would obviously be blamed, the whites would rise up in outrage, and Armageddon, the war between the blacks and the whites, would begin. The whites, in fear and outrage, would head to the ghettos to retaliate, but the blacks would ultimately triumph. They would begin rebuilding from the vast destruction this war of wars had caused, but they would find themselves unskilled at governing this new Caucasian-free planet. So naturally, they would turn to Manson and his family, who'd been living in the bottomless pit, located in the California desert, according to Charlie. By that time, the family would number 144,000, referred to in Revelation 7, and would reclaim a world that was now rid of the unenlightened, i.e., those who didn't listen to the warnings and the teachings of the angel of the bottomless pit, the reincarnated Christ, Charles Manson. Charles Manson and those members of his family who had the misfortune to follow his orders in pursuit of their own salvation: Susan Atkins, Charles Tex Watson, Lynette Fromm, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel are serving life sentences for the Tate/LaBianca murders. If you read the stories in this chapter as nothing more than cautionary tales, they will have served their purpose. But it's my hope that, beyond that, they'll demonstrate the tragic danger of letting fear in one charismatic, manipulative, power-driven voice turn doomsday from an eventual possibility to a self-fulfilled prophecy. One more time, anytime someone tells you they've received a message that even hints at harming any living creature, including yourself, you can count on it beyond all doubt that the message, if there really was one at all, did not come from God. And if they claim that they hold the key to the only true interpretation of the Bible, ask them right up front to clarify their position on the fifth commandment, which very clearly reads, "Thou shalt not kill."